stand there. Yeah, you should probably stand there. Yeah. That way I can direct you. Wherever you think is.
Okay. I'll stand there. What time is it?
Ready? All right. I'm ready, Dave.
Good evening. Hi. How's the food? You hear that, Nikki? Give Nikki a hand. And I don't know where Jim Lakely is, but apparently it started pouring down raining when he was at the barbecue grill, so give him a hand too. Because I think he may have messed up his hair preparing dinner tonight, but I'm glad it's good. Thank you all for being here. Very happy to see some faces and family and familiar faces in the crowd. Thank you for being here. Heartland Institute is no stranger to change and ideas and making a difference. That's what we do all day long. All right? Our Center for Constitutional Reform, our newest center, is one that is growing, and some excitement is happening over the past few months, given the groups that we've been working with. If you have not heard, for the first time in 150 years, there will be a planning convention in Arizona this year in September. Heartland will have a presence and create and produce some articles and videos that you'll eventually see in our newspapers and on our website. So there's very exciting things coming out of this center, and we're very pleased to have some movement happening. But before we get into introducing our speaker, who's here representing our center tonight, we have to take a few moments to brag about the great things that we're doing. That's our job, right? So to the left of you, some of you, your right, is the Michael Perry Mazur Library with over 14,000 volumes of free market research and articles and books. Please, please, please encourage people to come and visit and study. If they are a student or a local in the area, we hope that you'd invite them out to come and study at our library. It is the best free market library. It's my job to say that, but I really mean it. The best free market library in the Midwest, and we're very proud of it. If you want a tour later on, just grab me. I'm happy to do so. Something very exciting for Heartland that happened in just about a month ago is we elected a new president. Who's heard about it? Of course you've heard about it. If you receive emails from us or you receive any mailings from us, you've heard about our newly elected president, Dr. Tim Hillscamp, former Kansas congressman. We're very excited to have Tim Hillscamp. Boy, is he keeping us busy. It has been an interesting last few weeks, but something very special that we'll be doing on Saturday, September 9th, is we're hosting a picnic for freedom. And we hope that you'll all come out to our picnic for freedom and celebrate Tim's welcoming into Arlington Heights. We'll have our mayor, Thomas Hayes, here, Arlington Heights mayor. We'll have our darling Joe Walsh here, and he'll be giving a few remarks, as well as a few local groups like AM 560 who will be in the building. So we hope you'll join us on Saturday, September 9th, between 3 and 7. Please come out. So, without further ado, I'm here to introduce our speaker, Dave Shestokas. I have been practicing that for weeks. Ask Diane. Dave Shestokas, over the past 30 years, has served as prosecutor and criminal defense attorney. As an assistant state's attorney for Cook County in Illinois, he appeared in court in more than 10,000 criminal prosecutions. In recent years, he's hosted his own weekly program, Constitutionally Speaking, and has brought the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and Bill of Rights life through one of his recent books, Constitutional Soundbites. Dave was here a few months ago giving a presentation on his latest book, his previous book, Constitutional Soundbites. He has little cards at the registration table. He encouraged you to order a copy. Wonderful book. Dave is here tonight to talk about his most recent book, Creating the Declaration of Independence. In his most recent book, he takes us into the minds of the leaders who actually are responsible for our Constitution. He believes the oath he took for the U.S. Constitution, and his duty is to understand and explain the text of this world-changing document, as well as the philosophies serving as its foundation. During his presentation, you'll learn a lot about what was happening in the minds of Henry Lee, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. Very vivid story, and we're very excited to hear about it. We'll hold questions for after his presentation. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dave Shestokas. Thank you, Dave. Enjoy. And must I say, he is the only other person on earth I met who's able to work the middle tooth gap as well as myself. You just don't find that.
No, we belong with David Letterman, no question about it. Yes, we're among those people that are... I get compared often to David Letterman on that issue, but I'm happy to have somebody else to join me, Veronica. You know, we're happy to have somebody else to join. So thank you very much for that kind introduction and those kind words. It's wonderful to be here at Heartland, back at Heartland after a number of years. Actually, I've had a relationship with Heartland for a long, long time. Back in 1990, I was a Republican candidate for the United States Congress, and the only people that actually gave me help was Joe Bast and the Heartland Institute. They gave me policy information, they gave me documents, and gave me education on things that helped me talk while I was a candidate for Congress back in 1990. So my relationship with Heartland goes back, I don't want to calculate that. It's a long, long time. So I'm happy to be back here tonight. I'm going to be talking about my new book, Creating the Declaration of Independence. But before I do that, if you notice on the cover of the Creating the Declaration of Independence, there's a statue. Statue to Thomas Jefferson. And just yesterday, I heard the president say, "Who's next?" George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. I think the Charlottesville situation and those kinds of circumstances arise from the fact that people do not know our heritage and our history. They do not know the things that we share. And the situation where people want to take down, erase history, and rewrite history for their own purposes reminds me of things that are Orwellian. We heard a little bit about Animal Farm from Joe earlier tonight when we were having a conversation, but they're Orwellian. And a few years ago when the Taliban was active in Afghanistan, one of the first things that they were doing was blowing up monuments, blowing up 3,000-year-old pieces of the history of the Afghan people. And so history is really, really important in a number of ways. One of the things that you'll learn from Creating the Declaration of Independence is how important Jefferson took history and how important Richard Henry Lee took history when they came about and went about creating this new country. They didn't want to repeat the mistakes that had been made by countries being founded previously. And so history is really, really important, and actions to erase or change history or rewrite history are huge mistakes. And like I said, the president's comments when he talked about whether or not Washington or Jefferson would be next really struck home with me, and I think it's important that this statue remain and the history remains in the hearts and the minds of the American people, and that's what I'm trying to do with some of the things that I write and some of the things that I put together. Before the evening is out, we're going to go to the summer of 1776 for a little while. But at the moment, I want to do something a little bit more recent, the summer of 1987. In the summer of 1987, I had just graduated law school. In July, I took the bar and waited until September to hear the results. It took several months in those days because they had to, in addition to whether or not you actually passed the test, they ran what they call the character and fitness investigation for every applicant to determine whether they had the character and fit to become attorneys in the state of Illinois. And after I took the bar, I got the results in September, and I got an invitation via postcard to say, please join the other 800 and some odd people that had passed the bar and were going to be admitted at a big ceremony at Erie Crown Theater at McCormick Place, and take the oath of office as attorney. So I was really excited. I waited years for that moment, and so I called my family, my mom, my dad, everybody, and my friends. Then I put a message on my answering machine. The message on the answering machine, being very excited, said, "You've reached Dave Shestokas, attorney at law. I'll be playing golf Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday morning. Thursday, Friday, I'm going to take the weekends off, so if you're really lucky, you'll get a hold of me on Wednesday afternoon." I thought that this was pretty humorous and a bit self-deprecating on attorneys. In October, I got a letter from an organization that no attorney or potential attorney wants to get a letter from, called the Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Committee. And the letter said, "Please set up an appointment for an interview, and oh, by the way, you can't join your class in November, in the first week of November, to be sworn in." And I called all the attorneys I knew, I called my classmates, I called the ARDC, I said, "What's this all about?" Nobody would tell me. So I went there, and the first question I got was, "Oh, by the way, are you practicing law without a license?" Somewhere along the line, back in the days before there was caller ID, somebody from the bar admissions program that was investigating my character and fitness had called about a minor matter on my application. And they heard that you've reached Dave Shestokas, attorney at law. And they thought I was practicing law without a license. So I couldn't take the attorney oath of office with my class. They did not let me go to Erie Crown Theater because I had made this joke. Now, every attorney has to take an oath to support the Constitution. It's because of Article 6 in the Constitution itself that requires all officers, executive officers, legislative officers of both federal and the state governments, to take an oath to support the Constitution. They never told us really what that oath was about while we were in law school. When I didn't get to take it with my class, I got really, really much more impressed about the importance of the oath to support the Constitution of the United States. As a result, they ultimately did, in fact, allow me, after I went to the meeting in October and I explained to them that it was a joke, I hadn't practiced any law, they ultimately did give me permission to take the oath of office, but they did make it what turned out to be a very nice private ceremony with an appellate court judge in his chambers, along with my family. So it turned out to be really nice. I didn't go with the other 800 folks raising their hand, but it also impressed upon me the importance of something. We studied the Constitution in law school, but we studied constitutional law, which was all Supreme Court opinions. It really wasn't the Constitution. I didn't really realize that at the time. One thing we never did study was Article 6. Article 6, which provides that every officer, state and local, has to take a Article 6 oath. So I started taking the whole oath situation more seriously than I had in the past. And that started the 30-year journey. I would wind up taking that oath 7 more times as an elected official, as in admission to several other courts besides the state of Illinois. And ultimately it was, and as an assistant state's attorney, you wind up taking an oath a whole lot of times. And what I figured out was that people, when they take an oath to support the Constitution, they can't take that oath. Nobody takes that oath and to support, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Nobody does that so that the president can serve 4 years. Nobody does that so that tax bills have to originate in the House of Representatives. Nobody does that so that a judge can serve for life. They do it because of the American creed that you find in the Declaration of Independence. They do it because all men are created equal. Governments are instituted among men by the consent of the governed. And ultimately, I would learn that you really need to know the Declaration of Independence to understand the Constitution properly. Veronica mentioned Constitutional Soundbites. I had written that book. I wrote that book originally. And then when I got through with it, I went through the book and I found out there was 140 references to the Declaration of Independence. And, you know, probably 70% of the Bill of Rights has got to do with complaints against King George that you find in the Declaration of Independence. So you don't understand one without the other. So that 30-year journey with eight total oaths would ultimately result in creating the Declaration of Independence. Now, before we get to the summer of 1776, we're going to pause briefly in 1859. In 1859, a year and a half or so before he became president of the United States, and 4 years before he contributed to America's heritage of great thoughts at Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln, a great student of the Declaration of Independence, praised Thomas Jefferson's work. All honor to Jefferson, the man who had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times, that today and in all coming days shall be a stumbling block to tyranny and oppression. You know, Lincoln's praise of Jefferson is a great place to start, because 241 years after he wrote the Declaration and 158 years after Lincoln's praise, the Declaration of Independence remains a stumbling block to tyranny and despotism around the world. You might also note regarding the Declaration of Independence that it didn't just announce the birth of America. It actually did change the world. Since 1776, when the country came into being, there's been we now have about 194 countries in the world. More than 100 of them came into being with a document modeled after the Declaration of Independence. So the worldwide impact is just cannot be imagined. As to creating the Declaration of Independence, it's really in 3 parts. The first part really deals with 55 words that have become the American creed. They start with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," and wind up with the consent of the governed. The middle part of the book really deals with Richard Henry Lee and Thomas Jefferson and the things that they went through during the course of just about a 3-week period prior to July 4th in 1776. And the third and final part tells about the legal impact of the Declaration of Independence and a key phrase, the law of nature and nature's God. The 55 crucial words in the Declaration of Independence start with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Now, Jefferson distilled a century, it was over 100 years of Enlightenment thinking into that single remarkable sentence. With that sentence, he would give America her creed. This creed built around ideas that, if you consider them even for a moment, are clearly true or self-evident. Something self-evident, if it's really in no need of proof, can be taken for granted without explanation. The Declaration of Independence is built around concepts that are undoubtedly true at first impression of any reasonable person. Now, the truth found in those 55 words may be accepted as self-evident in much of the world today, hopefully in those 100 countries that pattern themselves after the Declaration of Independence. But in 1776, the world was made up of monarchies. Monarchies were the norm. Slavery was legal. The accepted truth at the time was that some were meant to rule over others. Declaration of Independence began to change that. The idea that people were born to rule over others, really had permeated human history for 10,000 years. And the fact is that began to change on the 4th of July, 1776, when that was published to the world. Now, we haven't, if you consider what the state of the world was before July 4th, 1776, and what's happened in the last 240 years, while the progress is incomplete, the progress has been monumental. Those 55 words are Thomas Jefferson's words with one single exception, and a very important exception. He originally wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." Ben Franklin made one edit. Ben Franklin made one single edit to the Declaration of Independence. He changed sacred and undeniable to self-evident. So we have Ben Franklin to thank for the ease that it's understandable, that it's true, undeniably true, that all men are created equal, that they are born with unalienable rights. Unalienable, inalienable. The original couple drafts of the Declaration of Independence have that scratched out like 3 times. Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin never could agree on whether it should be inalienable or unalienable, and sometimes I still stumble on it. The ultimate final copy did read unalienable, but they were never quite sure which one they wanted. So anyway, the hard part of trying to write something about these 55 words is where to start. Theoretically, these guys were huge students of history, and theoretically, you might even date some things back to the Roman Republic. You might go to the Magna Carta. You might go to the Pilgrims. You might go to the Battle of Bunker Hill or the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre. You might go to Thomas Paine's Common Sense. So where to start? June 7th, 1776. A fellow by the name of Richard Henry Lee, who is not well known, although perhaps he should be, stood up in the Second Continental Congress on June 7, 1776, and proposed this resolution, resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Now, creating the Declaration of Independence follows Richard Henry Lee through that day and a few days after, where he argues in favor of the resolution in the Congress himself. But the interesting thing about there's a couple interesting things. But Richard Henry Lee, had some problems in terms of sitting up and making that resolution, because nobody had ever mentioned in public or proposed independent states or proposed independence publicly. Why? You know, they'd already been at war for a year, for all practical purposes, after Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill. George Washington's army was stationed in New York while the British Armada was sailing from Canada down to New York. But mentioning independence in public meant committing treason against the king. And nobody wanted to be the first to commit treason publicly against the king. Now, treason was a pretty serious business in those days. And this is weighing heavily on Richard Henry Lee's mind when he's going over to Congress to make this proposition, because, well, the first thing that happens if you're convicted of treason to the king is that, in fact, they hang you, but they take you down before you're dead. Okay, and the next thing that happens after that is they cut your guts out. And the next thing that's after that is they burn you, and then after that they cut your head off. And the fact is that these guys knew another fella, Dr. Joseph Warren, who had taken a bullet at Bunker Hill and then ultimately wound up, British execution squads were traveling around the battlefield and found Dr. Warren laying on the battlefield. They did him in, they disemboweled him on the battlefield, and then they cut his head off. An interesting sidelight. They ultimately were able to prove that this was Dr. Warren's head because Paul Revere was a silversmith, and he'd given Dr. Warren a fake tooth. And so it was the first case of forensic dentistry that took place in the United States of America when they identified Dr. Warren's head by Paul Revere's tooth. But at any rate, this focused Richard Henry Lee's thinking when he was fixing to utter those words in public, because treason was serious business, and he was keenly aware of those penalties. And he was also keenly aware that the British actually did this stuff. So when Richard Henry Lee made this proposition, only John Adams stood up in support. For all the delegates and all the states and everybody else that was there, only John Adams stood up in support of that. He was the only one to join Richard Henry Lee out on this limb committing treason in public. What did Congress do when he made the proposition? They formed some committees. They formed 3 different committees. One of the committees was the Declaration Committee, to prepare a declaration in the event that Richard Henry Lee's resolution might be adopted. On that committee, Ben Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Nobody really wanted to be on that committee. They asked Franklin if he'd draft the Declaration of Independence, and he said, "I will never write anything that's going to be edited by a public committee." Sherman and Livingston really didn't participate in any meaningful way. They were there for political purposes, but they didn't really participate in any meaningful way. Nobody really thought this whole thing this declaration business was terribly, terribly important. Or they didn't want to be the guys that were committing treason. So nobody really thought that that was the case, and few wanted the assignment. Richard Henry Lee was not a member of the committee, though he proposed a resolution, and I urge you to find out in the book why not. Why Richard Henry Lee was not on the committee, though he'd been the proponent of the resolution. At any rate, Jefferson and Adams wound up spending a bunch of time about this over at City Tavern in Philadelphia. City Tavern over a beer, okay, over a couple of beers. Maybe by the time Adams got through with Jefferson, it might have been 4 or 5 beers, because even Jefferson didn't want to do it. Jefferson wanted to be in Virginia. In Virginia, they were writing the first state constitution in anticipation of independence. And he thought that it was more important to be in Virginia than to be in Philadelphia. And he really didn't want to be there. And actually, Richard Henry Lee got to go back to Virginia, and Thomas Jefferson was incredibly jealous of Richard Henry Lee. So Adams didn't want to do it either. He thought he had some more important work to do. And so after a few beers, Adams is talking to Jefferson, and he tells Tom, he gives Tom 5 reasons why he should write it. He says, "Tom, you're a Virginian. I'm from Massachusetts, and Massachusetts has been involved in all this other stuff, and people think I'm inviting people into the Massachusetts war, and so please, we need somebody from Virginia. You're a Southerner, I'm a Northerner, we need to bring along some of these other Southern colonies. And besides that, I'm kind of obnoxious and nobody likes me." And they'd go over my draft in a way they would never go over a draft from you. And Tom, though I've yet to hear you utter 3 sentences all put together in a single instance in the Congress, I've got a great opinion of the elegance of your pen. And I have little opinion of the elegance of my own. And finally, Tom, most importantly, you can write 10 times better than I can. Jefferson finally would acquiesce. And in the days following June 13, 1776, he'd proceed to create a timeless document that has stood as a stumbling block against tyranny and despotism ever since. You know, Jefferson did this while he didn't want to be in Philadelphia. He believed the important work was being done in Virginia. He did this actually, which brings us back to the beginning, he did this by reviewing the history of revolutions against the king over the history of mankind. He investigated revolutions over time and how they were announced and how they were discussed. He did this by applying his skills as a lawyer. He did this at 33 years of age. And he did this knowing he would also literally be placing his head on the chopping block. Part of the book explains how Thomas Jefferson defined what he called the American mind. He reviewed the public acts and public documents, certainly heavily influenced by Thomas Paine's common sense. Thomas Paine was probably the only guy, absent perhaps Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, Patrick Henry, to mention independence publicly. They didn't seem to much care about the treason situation, but they were the only two that were out there. And he did this by examining the philosophy of natural law. And it took the philosophy of natural law, applied his skills as a lawyer to explain the common sense of independence. He had to do this for a varied group of audiences, the leadership of the colonies, the international community, France, Spain, England. They hoped to have some allies. The Continental Army was already in New York, and they were trying to recruit more people for the Continental Army, but they wanted to have these guys have a reason to fight and die. And of course, he had to explain it to the American people, and he had to do it all in the confines of this work. Creating the Declaration of Independence explains actually how he did it and the things that he considered and the things that led him to what was included and what was not. The last section, we're in Jefferson's mind. We actually find out that while he's writing, he plays the violin. In the course of the time while he's there and writing, he also invents the swivel chair. He took down they had casters in the windows, right? He took the window down and took the windows apart and took the casters from the window, cut the top of the chair off, put the casters on the bottom, and created the swivel chair. And so, frankly, anytime you're at work and you spin around to talk to your colleague or you talk to your neighbor, you can thank Thomas Jefferson. And it was during the time he was writing the Declaration of Independence. He invented the swivel chair. Busy guy, violent, his mind's going every which way. So those are the kinds of things that we find in the book, the things that he considers, and some background on that. The things that Richard Henry Lee considers and why Richard Henry Lee didn't write the resolution, or write the Declaration. Yeah, the Declaration of Independence is 1,323 words long, not counting the signatures. We discussed the 55 words that Jefferson used to define the American mind and set the American creed. When I hear people say that's not who we are as Americans, where should you look to see who we are as Americans? I suggest it would be the Declaration of Independence in those 55 words. And I would also suggest that if we all did that, and everybody did, the common sense of the matter would in fact prevail. But at any rate, there's among those 1,323 words, there's 8 others that are also really, really important. The United States was founded on a philosophy, right? That it was going to be a government of law, not of men. This legal philosophy contained the truths that all men are created equal, they're all equal in the possession of natural rights to life, liberty, and if you call it the pursuit of happiness, you might also call it, as John Locke did originally, property. You also might call it be entitled to the benefits of the fruits of their labor. Pursuit of happiness has a little bit better ring to it. Jefferson was a good wordsmith, but in fact it was being entitled to the fruits of their labor. But if the country was going to be one of law, and not of men. It needed a legal, legitimate basis. There was something that men had no power to change. That's found in the phrase, the law of nature and nature's God. Jefferson did something there equally as remarkable when he was able to combine divine natural law and secular natural law into a single sentence of 8 words, so that it applies to pretty much everybody and everything. And the law of nature and nature's God actually provides that law that no man can change. Okay, the self-evident truths grow out of the law of nature and nature's God. The two components being divine natural law being revealed by God. Some people find it in scriptures, some find it in personal inspiration. But at any rate, there's a belief that there's law believed or revealed by God. Secular natural law, strangely enough, is something that's observable, biological, of natural phenomena. And the fact is that it describes a situation, let's say, that people can see, people can understand, they can touch, they can feel. But divine natural law and secular natural law, they come out in the same place. They come out in the same place that people have inalienable rights. Natural law, in its simplest form, indicates that there are things that no man can change. There's no government in the world can repeal, even though they'll probably try, they can't repeal the law of gravity, right? They can't say that gravity doesn't apply in our territory. Equally true is they can't order human beings to not want to be free. They can't say that they can pass a law that says you don't want your freedom, but it will be equally as ineffective as trying to repeal the law of gravity. So natural law in its simplest form recognizes those things, and Jefferson combined those two sources in those 8 words. Whether it's the scientific secular sense or whether or not it's the spiritual, divinely revealed sense, they come out in the same place. And Jefferson actually explains in a way that nobody could really ever repeat. And it's another example of his ability to do in a few words what others take whole books to explain. So the brilliance of the founding is actually encapsulated in the Declaration of Independence. It's the philosophical, but more importantly, I suggest that it's the legal basis for the legitimacy of the United States of America. It is not just the philosophical basis. It's, in fact, the legal basis. It had, in fact, a legal effect. The legal effect, of course, was dissolving the political bonds between the country and Great Britain. And so, in fact, it's not just a philosophical document, it's a legal document as well. Jefferson would later say, this was the object of the Declaration of Independence, not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not to merely say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent. The Declaration of Independence as the legal basis for the United States is pretty much never mentioned, seldom studied. But the truth is that it takes understanding of the Declaration of Independence to understand, or it took me understanding of the Declaration to understand the oath that I took 8 times. Before I fully understood it, I had to understand the relationship between the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. That's the goal of creating the Declaration of Independence. The book is to explain the common sense of the subject. I'll take some questions if somebody has them.
Thank you so much, David. Am I on here? Am I on? Doesn't matter, I'm loud. Thank you so much. We're gonna have two staff members in the room who's gonna be executing Q&A. Chris Talgo here in the back with the white sweater.
Who needs this when you're as loud as me? Got it. And John Northrup, our Director of Government Relations, who will also be executing Q&A. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll make our way to you with the microphone. Heartland staff like to keep the microphone in our hand, not because we're rude, but because it helps us keep control of the crowd. And if you have a question, please raise your hand. We're not a shy crowd. Diane.
Sure, let's get it rolling.
Get it
You know,
rolling.
why is my picture so big? That's what and why do I have so much hair?
Photoshop's amazing. Isn't it?
No, actually, I'm gonna go with two quick questions. The first one should be easy. You keep referring to the 8 words concerning divine law, secular natural law, but your slides only show 7 words. So you're driving me nuts. All right, Jill.
Diane is our
All right,
executive
so
editor.
is that
The law of nature and nature's.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
The law of nature.
Yep.
Oh,
Trust
it's-
me.
And of nature's God.
Gotcha. All right. Very good. Thank you very much.
The law of nature, in the Declaration, it's and of nature's God.
Got it. Okay. That makes this editor feel much better. And then the second quick question is, how did you discover all of this stuff? What sort of research did you do? The discovery of Thomas Jefferson being the guy who invented the swivel chair. Where does all this stuff come from?
30 years?
I know that's time, but
yeah.
where?
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, there's conversations in the book that arise from, with Jefferson and Adams. There are letters from Jefferson and Adams that are available at the Library of Congress website. There is the June 7th day indicates a few other things that are going on June 7th besides what Richard Henry Lee did. They were discussing some things about poor gunpowder. They were discussing some things about compensating a fellow whose sloop they had commandeered. They were discussing, there's one other issue. At any rate, the minutes of the meetings are also available in the Library of Congress. The minutes of the meetings that they held on June 7th were there. Jefferson's, in fact, wrote a letter indicating about the common sense of the matter. So all that material is available in disparate places, and it's all accurate and represented. One of the interesting things I think in the book as well is that John Adams had indicated that he thought July 2nd was going to be the day we would celebrate, because that was in fact the day that they adopted Lee's resolution. They spent another couple of days editing Jefferson's work on the Declaration of Independence. He called it, he said that they emasculated his work, and they cut out about 25% of it. Which brings us back to the whole tearing down of statues and President mentioning about Jefferson owning slaves and things of that nature. One of the things about a good chunk of the 25% that they cut out of the Declaration of Independence was Jefferson's excoriation of the slave trade and his blaming King George for not allowing the slave trade to be abolished internationally. And they cut that out of Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence. Also in the book, you'll find some of Jefferson's proposals for the original Virginia Constitution, one of which was that from the day of the adoption of the Constitution, no new slaves could be brought into Virginia, with the ultimate hope that slavery would become extinct. And it's just too bad that people don't really understand a variety of history. Jefferson actually did understand the dichotomy between all men are created equal and the situation and the actual existence of slavery. That's in the book. His draft of the Virginia Constitution is available in a variety of places. Needless to say, he didn't get to Virginia to defend that because he was busy in Philadelphia writing the Declaration of Independence. So a lot of it's available in resources in the Library of Congress. A lot of it's available. There's a really, really great book, the American Sacred Text. I'm trying to think of Dr. Mayer's title, but there's a great book that's in the bibliography that has a lot of references and resources to that. So it's all available. Putting it together to tell it, make it a story, was a great deal of fun, and it was. There's also some things that jumped out at me. Jefferson was a lawyer, and lawyers work with form books, right? The book explains how the Declaration of Independence, if you put it side by side with a legal complaint, law complaint, something that starts a lawsuit, they're the same thing. This could have been USA versus King George, right? You start out with a title, and then you have the plaintiff, which was the colonies, and then you describe the defendant, then you describe what bad thing. You describe the law, which was the law of nature. Nature's God. Then you describe all the bad things that the defendant does in violation of the law, and then you come to the conclusion. The conclusion here, independence. So one of the ways that Jefferson did this in such a short period of time could be anywhere from 6 days to 10 days. Nobody's sure exactly when the final draft was completed. There's no particular record on that, but he did it very, very quickly. And what he did was he found a form in his form book, and he filled in the blanks. And obviously with some very, very good words, but he filled in the blanks. And so that's one of the ways he did it so quickly. And the book explains that. Yes, sir.
More questions?
You mentioned in your talk that the original proposition, which was up on the screen, included the states as being independent. And there seems to be little or nothing in the Declaration of Independence referring to the difference between, or who was to be independent. Was it the people? Was it the central government or the states? Did you, in your research, find Jefferson's opinions as to who was being declared independent?
He certainly agreed with everything that, the people at the time, when John Adams would say, my country, he was talking about Massachusetts. Jefferson, that's why Jefferson thought being in Virginia was much more important than being in Philadelphia. So at the time, they were a loose wartime confederation. They weren't particularly an entire country. And of course, it's the title of the introduction to the Declaration indicates we are the United Colonies, or the United States in Congress assembled. And so United States was not a singular noun at the time. The United States was a multiple collective noun at the time. So Jefferson didn't indicate that. He indicated the states as a group were becoming independent, and that would be led through or found out when, in fact, the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783 to end the war. They actually named each individual state. Each individual state was a signatory to the Treaty of Paris. It wasn't the singular central government. It wasn't the Continental Congress that signed the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War. It was Great Britain and the 13 individual states. So they were still individual states, even though they adopted, in 1777, they had adopted the Articles of Confederation. They still considered that sort of a loose arrangement to cooperate on certain matters, but they didn't consider themselves an entire country at the time.
Thank you. I've just been rereading the words that you put up on, including the ones you left out. But
Yes, there's only so much room on the screen.
okay,
All the words are in the book.
you're condemned to editor's hell, which is, I won't describe it, but
Please.
it's terrible. In the Declaration, it says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. It seems like that probably could be used by the Confederates to justify the secession from the Union. I'm an economist, and I don't believe that the Civil War was fought over slavery. It was fought over the fact that the South believed in free trade and the North was protectionist. And it was in the interest of the North to drive down the price of raw materials, especially cotton, so that they would make their textile mills more viable. The textile mills were not known for being terribly sympathetic for their employees.
That's entirely accurate. And the phrase you refer to would be also why, maybe among the reasons that, in fact, we are not taught the Declaration of Independence on a regular basis, because it includes the right of revolution. And Constitutional Soundbites, my first book, in fact, does discuss that matter. Talks about the fact that that's one of the reasons we have Article 5 in the Constitution that allows for a variety of amending processes to provide. The combination of elections and amending processes were supposed to be an outlet for bloodless revolution and give an opportunity to resolve things without fighting. However, nevertheless, I would suggest that there is the provision for the right of revolution in the Declaration of Independence. And there's a strong argument that, in fact, secession does exist as of right if you're, in fact, as a particular group of people, because, of course, they were claiming the right of revolution with the issuance of the Declaration of Independence. It's a revolutionary document. It's uncomfortable for an established government to find its revolutionary roots. And so there's been a lot of argument placed on, and that's largely ignored in many, many sectors. It's in the first book. We address it in the first book, but I agree with you. I agree with you. And by the way, you're right. There were multiple causes, among them the tariffs that the North was imposing, and as a result, the South was paying most of the cost of the tariffs for the imported goods than the North was. So there was multiple economic reasons beyond just simply the slavery issue. Lincoln came a little late to that, actually, but that's another subject. Yes, sir.
Yeah. With respect to that, with respect to that, the President Lincoln's first State of the Union, is that where his legal case is set out in terms of why he felt the way he felt about the process that they had to follow under the Constitution to secede, or to amend the Constitution to withdraw, number one, and number two, what do you think of the substance of his argument in his first State of the Union address?
Lincoln came up with a different kind of argument and indicated that the Union actually preceded the Constitution, and he argued, in fact, that because the Union preceded the Constitution, it was singular and indissoluble, and that people could not leave the Union as a result of its existence. He also indicated that regarding the Constitution, no country had ever been founded and sown the seeds of its own destruction within its organic document. No. No, he didn't. He did not say that it could not be amended for that purpose. But of course, there was never such an amendment passed, and indicated originally that in fact no government, at least this was his theory, was that no government would in its organic document provide for the seeds of its own destruction.
Hold on one second, Fred. We gotta get you on the mic for our audience in here. Online.
Is it in the Constitution, this language? To my head, that in order to form a more perfect union, they entered into the Constitution, was part of Lincoln's argument?
No, that was not part of Lincoln's argument, because in fact that was not the meaning of it. That's also in the first book. More perfect. One of the things about the Constitution is, of course, we try and sometimes, the meaning of language changes over time. And if you're going to read the Constitution and its actual meaning, what you actually have to understand is what its original public meaning was at the time. In 1787, the understanding of the term perfect would be more what we would say perfect. That is, they had an incomplete union under the Articles of Confederation. And they were referring to perfect in the Latin root sense. The Latin root word for the perfect is perficiere. And perficiere means to complete. And what they were talking about when they said a more perfect union, when Gouverneur Morris wrote those words, and when Gouverneur Morris was writing those words, he was talking about a union that was more complete than the union that existed under the Articles of Confederation. More perfect in his in understanding, but in the 21st century, what we understand the term perfect to be is without sin, cannot be improved upon. Yeah, but the 18th century meaning was different from what the 21st century ear hears, and that's also in the first book. That's also in Constitutional Settlement. That was not Lincoln's argument.
Thank you, Fred. Any more questions? We have McGregor here, and then Chris, you can take Carl. We should do.
Oh, and to my Lithuanian friends in the audience that I met before, Labas. Yes.
Hi, thank you for this really interesting talk. Use the term or adjective bloodless, and it made me think of something that I've had in my mind for the last 40 years. Am I correct in thinking that Jefferson had said that we needed a bloodless revolution like every 20 years?
Oh, no. No. What Jefferson said is the tree of liberty should often be refreshed by the blood of tyrants and patriots. Tyrants or despots and patriots, something to that effect. But he indicated that a little revolution was good once in a while. There was something he indicated. But there was also a proposal that he wanted in the Constitution that would allow for a constitutional convention every 20 years. So when you're talking about, those are two different concepts that Jefferson had. One was for a constitutional, but of course he didn't have any input into that at the time because he was minister to France. He was stuck over in France with Sally Hemings.
I'm asking you because you're the expert, and I never bothered to look it up if it was accurate or not.
Well, there's two quotes. One was where he was talking about it's a good idea to have a little revolution once in a while where in fact some blood is shed. But he actually had sent John Adams a proposal that every 20 years there should in fact be a revision of the Constitution so that the dead hand of a previous generation did not rule the next, which was also Jefferson's term. Amazing guy with words.
Next question is Carl here.
You mentioned the Treaty of Paris. In Highland Park, one of my neighbors had the table that the Treaty of Paris was signed on. Now it's in the State Department. It was donated by the family, and it's one of their prime exhibits in the museum in the State Department.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. How did your Wow, that's amazing. The Treaty of Paris situation was pretty amazing in a couple of ways, not the least of which is was a famous American painter whose name escapes me at the moment. They wanted to paint everybody, but he only got to paint John Jay, Ben Franklin, and the third American guy there, because the British guys wouldn't sit for the painting because they were embarrassed they lost.
Treaty of Paris, basically Benjamin Franklin was the only person to sign all three documents, founding documents. You know.
Yeah, the Treaty of Paris, the Declaration of Independence, and the Treaty of Paris, and the Constitution. Yeah, he was the only person to sign all three. Which, by the way, Richard Henry Lee and his brother were the only brothers to sign the Declaration of Independence. I don't know where this
We got
comes
a
from.
question back here.
I don't know where that came from, John.
Again, thank you very much for talking about something very important to us, and thank you, Heartland. I just sent copies of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, which I picked off this table, to my 5 grandchildren with a strong note, and hopefully they'll read it. But I'm very concerned. We went some time ago to a meeting in Naperville's North High to hear Howard Zen. He's now dead. But he's the hero of our educators with Bill Ayers, and they spell out to teachers and students, and he really got a big applause, how bad this country is. And Mary and I attended a meeting at Fourth Presbyterian Church, one of the most beautiful buildings on Michigan Avenue, sponsored by the presidents of Princeton Seminary and McCormick Seminary and the Chicago Presbytery of 50 churches. And the speaker outlined what a terrible country we are. You know, we're founded by racists, and our companies were founded by racists, and that we ought to pay reparations. And then they had a panel of distinguished people explaining why all this shooting is taking place. It's because we're such a bad country, white racism. So my question is, you know, how do we counter this? How do we get people informed? I mean, our church groups, there's a Wall Street Journal article the other day spelling out how our church leaders have turned to the left and are doing this. How do we inform people and alert people and get people to understand what a great country this is?
Give them the books. Yeah, no, I would suggest that, and that's a question. That's a kind of a question that I get on a pretty regular basis. And one of the important things in this presentation and other presentations I make is really consider the state of the world when these guys went to work and the state of the world after they completed their work. When they went to work, the world was governed by kings and sultans and czars and pashas and chiefs and anything you could imagine that just basically said, we and a few other people are in charge of all the other people around. The idea that people could rule themselves just simply was never executed, never existed, with perhaps a small, short period in a small group of people during the early days of the Roman Republic. But absent that, this had never, and of course the Romans had slaves. And they had white slaves, by the way, for whatever that's worth. But slavery had existed. The idea that rulers, that some were meant to rule over others, was really the self-evident truth of the world. Before Jefferson went to work, before the preamble, before the Constitution was put into play. And so, when you measure what's happened in the 240 years since, and those 55 words standing as a bulwark against tyranny and despotism in the 240 years since, compared to the 10,000 years of human history that went on before the United States of America, I would certainly suggest that they made a tremendous difference. They made a tremendous difference, and they were aware of the dichotomies. They were aware of what they were aware of what they were up against, and they were aware of that they weren't going to complete that work at the time. But what they set in motion is why we have a great country today. Well, I might suggest there's some people that, there's a few people that, in fact, do that. I'm encouraged by the fact that I have 125,000 Twitter followers. I would suggest to you that these ideas are not anathema to a whole lot of folks. But I would also suggest that what we're battling is the 240 years of stuff that's been piled on to the common sense. And if we can explain the common sense, and generally speaking, there's been so, I did a presentation about this book when it was brand new in Oak Park. Not exactly a conservative bastion, if you would say. And really, by the time I was through, everybody's head in the room was going, oh my goodness, this is just common sense. It's not that complicated. And for whatever reason, it's very, very unfortunate. There's too many lawyers got a hold of too much stuff. What they did, yeah, they should be out playing golf, really. And they've made themselves self-important by making it more complicated and more complex than it is. It's not really that complicated. And that's kind of what I try and point out in both these books, and I certainly get a good reception from whatever audience, because I present these ideas as not liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican, but actually American. This is who we're supposed to be as Americans. The fact is this was the first country that was ever founded on an idea. The whole premise that, my English isn't too bad, but even if I went over and lived for 20 years and pledged allegiance to the Queen, I'd never be British. And throughout our history, the general situation is that you came here, you understood the principles, you subscribed to the principles, and you became American. We've lost that because we don't teach the principles. We've lost that because we don't teach the principles. We don't teach much of our history. I'm familiar with Zinn's work, which is just horrendous. It's not to say that there's not dark spots in our history. There certainly are dark spots in our history. But we are the best great hope for mankind. And I don't think that people understand that.
All right, we have time for one more question. Any takers?
All right, of course, go back.
Do you endorse any of the proposals going around for a convention of the states to amend the U.S. Constitution?
There's several, as I know, and I am in terms of endorsing one. The one that I'm actually most familiar with, compared to there's the Balanced Budget Amendment folks, there's the Convention of States folks, and the other one is the Compact for America. And frankly, I have come to know Nick Dranius fairly well. I came and saw him speak at Heartland. He was on my radio show some time ago, and I studied the proposal of the Compact for America. And if I was going to endorse one of the projects, I would certainly say the Compact for America that Nick and the Goldwater Institute are largely behind and moving along with. I think they have 5 members of the Compact at the moment, and I know they have a number of those pending. The Compact for America has related to Joe's question, and I mentioned before Article 5 is regarding the provisions for a bloodless revolution, and that's kind of what Article 5 provides. It provides for changing the Constitution outside. We've only used one method before, and that's proposals for amendments by the Congress. There's also a second method for amending the Constitution, and that is for a convention of states to get together and provide for and propose amendments for ratification by the group of states, and all that work would entirely be outside the purview of Congress. A lot of people who are against those things are concerned about runaway convention and people that would do things that propose to abolish the Second Amendment or other kinds of issues like that. What's interesting about the Compact for America is that the proposed amendment through the compact system would be in place before the convention ever met, and the only work that they would do would be on that particular amendment that has to do with controlling the national debt, controlling a debt ceiling. And because of the whole, I think Nick and his people have done just a tremendous job on that. And if I was going to endorse one, but frankly, all the boogeymen that they talk about regarding the convention and state, you still wind up having to have whatever gets proposed ratified by 3/4 of the states. 3/4 of the states have never abolished the Second Amendment. So I'm not, all the arguments for, that people say about the dangers of a runaway convention or whatever, and actually they cite 1787 as an example because they were supposed to only amend the Articles of Confederation rather than propose a new constitution. But I think the only way you're going to get any real reform at the federal level is to take the amendment process out of the hands of Congress. And the founders had the vision and the foresight to make that provision available.
And a follow-up question, will you be in Arizona on September 12th this year for the convention?
Is that an invitation?
Out of curiosity.
I don't have any plans to at the moment.
Interesting.
I don't have any plans to at the moment. Actually, I'm going to be, right around then, I'm going to be in Iowa. I'm going to be in Indiana. There's some committees on social studies in both those states that I'm doing some presentations on constitutional education for some of those folks. And hopefully we'll encourage them to, and actually somebody's actually talked me into dressing up as Thomas Jefferson to do this.
Awesome.
Which should be fun. But the hard part about that is Jefferson's hair was red. You can find a white wig, you can find a black wig. Finding a red revolutionary wig is a bit of a challenge. It's a bit of a challenge.
Well, thank you so much, Dave. Let's give our speaker a round of applause. You did a great job. Harlan's next event in this event space is August 30th. For our healthcare center, we'll have Dave Racer here talking about passion for patients. We hope you can come out, same back time, same back place, 5:30 to 7:30. Prior to that, this Saturday, Heartland's Women's Book Club, yes, women only, sorry, gentlemen, will be meeting at 1 p.m. I see some of my regulars in the room. Thanks for coming out tonight. They can tell you how wonderful of a time we have every month on Saturday. So if you are a lady who's interested in attending our book club meetings monthly on Saturdays, please find me before you head out, and I'll be sure to get you some details. And then finally, lastly, we really, really hope you attend our Picnic for Freedom on September 9th in celebration of our newly elected president, Dr. Tim Hillscamp. We're going to be celebrating him and introducing him to some key folks in Arlington Heights, and we hope you'll be there. Looks to me like the rain has stopped, so you should have a safe travel home. Thanks again for coming out. We have books for sale in the back, Creating the Declaration of Independence, and Dave is happy to stick around and talk about the book and sign some copies. Thank you for coming out and enjoy your night.